thousands of years, one breath has endured. More than a martial art, it is the Korean way of life. Taekwondo, connecting the world. Smarter than ever, Taekwondo leaps toward a new future, connecting the world through a single movement. The spirit of Korea meets the boundless energy of K-pop. No longer just a sport, Taekwondo is at the heart of K-culture, bringing Korea's spirit to the world. A beautiful culture, connecting heart to heart. We now strive to safeguard Taekwondo's community training culture as a treasured heritage for all humanity. The pride of Korea, Taekwondo.
Ideas ahead of their time have shaped a better world. A man who believed that culture could bring peace to the world. Kim Koo. The one thing I seek in infinite quantity is the power of a highly developed culture. This is because the power of culture brings happiness and meaning to our lives, and by extension, to the lives of others. My wish, culture of peace. 150th anniversary of the birth of Kim Koo.
U.S. President Donald Trump says he'll meet North Korean leader Kim Jong-un before the end of the year, as Pyongyang's emphasis on the two leaders' personal ties leaves the door open to renewed diplomacy. President Kim Jong-un has praised U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to scale back joint military drills, calling it a meaningful step toward creating conditions for dialogue and lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. Also on Thursday, President Yi met with China's top diplomat Wang Yi in Seoul, calling for closer strategic communication with Beijing on bilateral ties and issues surrounding the Korean Peninsula. We begin with North Korea's latest missile launch. South Korea's Joint Chief of Staff says the North fired around 10 short-range ballistic missiles from the regime's capital region toward the East Sea at around 5 p.m. on Thursday. Now, the missiles flew around 300 kilometers, with the South Korean and U.S. authorities are now analyzing their exact specifications. The National Security Office convened an emergency security meeting to assess the launch's impact on South Korea's national security and ordered necessary measures while calling for a heightened readiness. It also condemned the launch as a serious violation of UN Security Council resolutions and urged Pyongyang to immediately halt. Now, Thursday's launch comes amid the ongoing South Korea-U.S. joint military exercise, which ends Friday, and making it the 12th such launch this year. Now, in the meantime, U.S. President Donald Trump is once again signaling his willingness to resume talks with North Korea. And as a prospect of another Trump-Kit summit draw attention, Trump has also made a rare reference to the size of Pyongyang's nuclear arsenal. Our defense correspondent Park Kwon reports.
U.S. President Donald Trump said he'll be meeting North Korean leader Kim Jong-un later this year. The remarks came while speaking to reporters at the White House on Wednesday local time, and just days after ordering the Department of War to scale back the ongoing Ulchi Freedom Shield exercise with South Korea, a move seen as an overture to Pyongyang. The Wall Street Journal previously reported that Trump has instructed his aides to pursue a meeting with Kim as soon as this fall, raising speculation that the two could meet around the APEC summit in China this November. Trump also made a public reference to the size of North Korea's nuclear arsenal.
He has 57 very powerful nuclear weapons. Should have never allowed it to happen. They should have never allowed it. If I were president, I wouldn't have allowed it.
One expert says such remarks disclosing an exact figure are unprecedented.
It's extremely rare for a president to publicly state how many nuclear weapons the North possesses. Trump may be trying to show U.S. voters how urgent the North Korean nuclear issue is and why he believes another summit with Kim Jong-un is necessary.
The professor also raised concerns that this could shift the focus of future U.S.-North Korea talks from denuclearization to arms control, potentially suggesting Washington is treating Pyongyang as a de facto nuclear armed regime. On the local front, Trump's figure differs from an estimate cited by South Korean Defense Minister An Gyubek during a parliamentary session on Thursday. An said private research groups estimate North Korea could possess between 80 and 120 nuclear weapons.
It's difficult to give an exact figure. I don't think it would be appropriate for me, as South Korea's defense minister, to comment on the U.S. estimate of around 57.
But when asked whether Seoul recognizes Pyongyang as being nuclear armed, An said he cannot officially do so, calling it instead a matter of being strategically prepared for all possibilities. The South Korean government has maintained its position and has refrained from publicly discussing such details. A defense ministry official reaffirmed Thursday Seoul's position that it cannot allow North Korea to have possession of nuclear weapons. 박건우, Arirang News.
Now, before today's missile launch, North Korea broke its silence on President Trump's latest overtures, acknowledging his personal ties with Kim Jong-un while casting doubt on any recent communication between the two leaders. Kim Do-yeon has more.
U.S. President Donald Trump sent a series of comments and claims in an effort to reach out to North Korea, which also prompted a response in what analysts now see as a phase of testing the waters between both sides. North Korea's Kim Yo-jong, Kim Jong-un's sister, shared a message through state-run media Korean Central News Agency at 10 p.m. Wednesday, dismissing Washington's decision to scale back joint military exercises and denying direct communication between its leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump. However, the message's timing has grabbed attention.
That shows Pyongyang sees this as a sensitive issue and intends to manage the message actively and quickly. Responding at 10 p.m., right as the details were coming out of the U.S. side, shows a strong intent to actively manage the message.
While Kim Yo-jong claimed the regime feels no interest in temporary drill reduction, saying Pyongyang will not respond if Washington attempts to frame the scale-back exercises as a goodwill gesture, she emphasized the North Korean leader still maintains good memories and feelings toward Trump personally.
This isn't a direct refusal to talk. I think it's Pyongyang maintaining ambiguity around the two leaders' personal ties, while pressing Washington to come forward with a firmer, more concrete commitment to end its hostile policy toward the North.
Analysts say North Korea is holding out for substantial policy shifts before agreeing to formal negotiations. Meanwhile, South Korea's unification ministry urged the regime to engage, noting that Trump's decision aims to initiate dialogue and promote peace. A ministry official stressed that ending the war and establishing peace on the Korean peninsula must be prioritized above all else. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
While Trump's push for talks with Kim Jong-un continues, President Lee Jae-myung has welcomed Trump's move to scale back joint military drills, praising it as a bold step toward renewed dialogue with North Korea and peace on the Korean peninsula. Yoon Jung-min has more.
Citing President Trump's recent social media posts, President Lee Jae-myung said he agrees with the U.S. leaders' will and efforts to build peace on the Korean peninsula, even at the cost of scaling down the annual Seoul-Washington combined defense drills. On social media on Wednesday, Lee called it a big decision to move beyond hostility and said he respected the U.S. president's efforts to create an environment to resume dialogue with North Korea. The South Korean president hoped for trust building and a resumption of talks between North Korea and the U.S., reiterating to take on the role of a pacemaker, while Trump plays the role of a peacemaker. He added that he hoped to meet with his American counterpart in the near future. He also said he fully agreed with Trump that Seoul should be responsible for its own defense, comments he often revisits, adding that the country is ranked 5th in global military power and that it aims to increase defense spending to 3.5% of its GDP.
동맹이 굳건해야 안보의 근간이 더 튼튼해질 것이고 또 우리 자신의 힘을 키워야 동맹으로서의 가치와 필요성도 더 커지게 됩니다.
On the efforts to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the South Korean leader noted that the country will continue to communicate closely with the U.S. and review its contribution within the purview of domestic law. Trump has accused South Korea of not joining action against Iran. The main opposition People Power Party criticized President Lee's comments on the reduction of the joint drill as a, quote, psychological victory, arguing that the Iran war and a delay in U.S. investment are the main factors. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Also here in Seoul, China's top diplomat is in South Korea and has met President Lee Jae-myung following his talks with Foreign Minister Cho Hyun on bilateral ties and North Korea. Our Oh Seung has the details of their meeting.
President Lee Jae-myung met with China's top diplomat Wang Yi on Thursday, calling for strategic communication as Seoul and Beijing seek ways to fully restore bilateral ties and as Yi calls for a peace regime with Pyongyang. The meeting took place in the morning, according to the Blue House's press release, with President Yi conveying his warm regards to Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Lauding progress made in the improvement of bilateral relations, he asked Wang to maintain close strategic communication with Foreign Minister Cho Hyun and National Security Advisor Wi Song-lak on Korea-China relations, the Korean Peninsula and other issues. This came after the Chinese official talks with Foreign Minister Cho Hyun on Wednesday. Over their 4-hour talks and official dinner, the two diplomats discussed affairs on the Korean Peninsula, with Cho requesting China's constructive role in securing Pyongyang's return to talks.
As much as President Lee Jae-myung presented a blueprint for peaceful coexistence on the Korean Peninsula in his recent Liberation Day address, the government will continue working toward the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the achievement of peace.
According to Seoul officials, Wang said China's policy remained consistent and pledged to keep playing a constructive role in promoting peace and stability.
We also hope that South Korea and North Korea can gradually move along the path towards peace and coexistence, and sincerely wish for the continued stability and development of the Korean Peninsula.
The Chinese minister, however, did not mention denuclearization. As Wang left his meeting, he told the media that renewed dialogue was a matter for the United States and North Korea to decide. He put the onus on Washington, saying it must change its long-standing hostile policy towards North Korea. This highlights lingering differences between Seoul and Beijing amid a deepening US-China rivalry over regional security and technology. Still, both sides have sought to rebuild cooperation, seeking the, quote, full restoration of bilateral ties.
This marks Wang's first official visit to Korea in almost 5 years and comes ahead of the two countries' 34th anniversary of diplomatic relations, which falls on August 24th.
The ministers agreed to use next year's 35th anniversary to elevate their ties, focusing on services and investment negotiations under the bilateral free trade agreement, supply chain stability, people-to-people and cultural exchanges, bringing pandas to Korea, and preserving Korean independence movement sites in China. According to a foreign ministry official on Thursday, the two sides also agreed to work towards another leaders' meeting when China hosts the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in November. Oh Seung, Arirang News.
Wall Street has felt some relief as the U.S. Treasury yields eased, following the Treasury Department's move to inject more liquidity into the long-term bond market. For more on this, we invite our Kim Bo-kyung into the studio. Welcome back, Bo-kyung.
Thanks for having me.
Bo-kyung, first things first, the Trump administration had to step in as the bond market sent a warning signal. Now, what did the Treasury Department announce?
Right. So after long-term Treasury yields hit their highest levels in years, the U.S. Treasury said on Wednesday that it will at least double its buybacks of 10 to 30-year treasuries. Each purchase will increase from $2 billion to at least $4 billion temporarily from September 9th through November 4th. Long-term Treasury yields had soared to 19-year highs on Tuesday, with the 30-year yield hitting around 5.33% and the 10-year yield topping 4.7%. Well, after the announcement, the 30-year yield fell as low as 5.18%, while the 10-year yield dropped to 4.63%. This fall led U.S. stocks to close slightly higher on Wednesday, with the Dow up 0.22%, the S&P 500 0.21%, and the Nasdaq 0.16%.
Then, Pyongyang, what drove the recent surge in the yields?
Right, so the sharp rise in long-term Treasury yields came amid growing concerns over inflation, fueled by prolonged conflicts in the Middle East.
Because the conflict in the Middle East remains at stalemate and oil prices are going up, there's an expectation that inflation is going to be higher for longer, and that's going to further erode the kind of returns that bond investors are used to getting.
Well, investors are also demanding higher returns amid ballooning government deficits. According to the U.S. Treasury Department on Wednesday, America's total national debt has surpassed $40 trillion for the first time. Well, that's up from $30 trillion in January 2022, less than 5 years ago. And another factor behind the global bond sell-off is the AI investment boom. Major tech companies such as Microsoft and Meta are issuing massive amounts of corporate debt to buy NVIDIA's AI chips and build data centers, competing with government bonds for investor capital.
Well, Pyongyang, the market has cooled down a bit, but many experts see this as a short-term fix, don't they?
Right. So one expert I spoke with also said that the U.S. Treasury's buyback is not going to be the fundamental solution. Let's take a listen.
There's still a great deal of uncertainty and concern in the market over these bonds. Therefore, unless the U.S. government introduces a bold policy, I believe there will be a limit to how much Treasury yields can come down.
Well, another expert said South Korea's long-term bond yields could also rise as investors keep a close eye on its fiscal deficit and national debt.
Korea's government debt is perhaps lower than other countries, but government deficit is very high and debt is increasing. So international investors have reasons to be nervous about Korea.
And when it comes to the impact on stocks, the same experts said rising bond yields would normally weigh on the market, but the impact could be limited for now due to the AI boom and strong demand for semiconductors.
For the exchange rates and the stock market, because these demand for Samsung Electronics and Hynix, the semiconductor producers, are just so strong, and they do not seem to be affected by what's happening in the government bond markets. I expect the Kospi numbers, the exchange rates, to not respond that much to what's happening in the government bond markets.
So basically, without semiconductors, the factors we discussed would likely weigh on the Kospi. But with semiconductors in the picture, the market is likely to be driven largely by demand for chip makers. So we'll have to see how it plays out.
Indeed, that is all the questions I have for you, Pyongyang. Thank you for the wrap-up.
Thank you.
Korea's Industry Minister Kim Jong-un said the first Korean investment project in the U.S. will be announced sometime in September. Speaking to the reporters after returning from Washington on Thursday, Kim said he held talks with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and the two sides had resolved many outstanding issues, calling it significant progress. The minister said the first project is likely to focus on energy. Now, he made the trip to Washington as the negotiations over the first major investment project reached a critical stage, though several issues still remain unresolved at the working level. Now, the two sides will continue negotiations through a video conference next week. After a lengthy hiatus following the election of the ruling party's new leadership, Korea's assembly returned to full-scale proceedings today, passing a number of bills through a bipartisan agreement. Our National Assembly correspondent An Sung-jin has the details.
The National Assembly passed a bill to shorten the parliamentary fast-track review process for legislation from a maximum of 330 days to just 90 on Thursday. The bill passed with 153 lawmakers voting in favor out of 234 members present. The measure was first put to a vote on July 31st, but after the main opposition People Power Party launched a filibuster, its passage had been delayed. After the filibuster ended with the July extraordinary session closing, it was the first bill to come to a vote at the plenary session for August. The ruling Democratic Party argued that the current fast-track system is an obstacle to speedy legislation and vowed for an efficient system. The opposition continues to criticize the move, accusing the ruling party of unilaterally changing parliamentary rules without allowing sufficient time for deliberation. Alongside this contentious bill, around 70 pieces of legislation were passed and agreed upon by both the ruling and main opposition parties. Some of these bills include amendments to the Urban and Residential Environment Improvement Act, as well as a special act on public housing. Another real estate-related measure, an amendment to the Yongsan Park Special Act, has been postponed until next week pending talks between the land minister and the mayor of Seoul. The PPP says it will support housing and livelihood bills agreed upon by both parties, but opposes this amendment, citing concerns over damage to green space. The DP, on the other hand, suggests that the measure alone would not allow housing to be built on the main park itself, and that additional legal changes would be needed for actual housing development. The amendment would ease park and green space requirements in designated mixed-use development zones, such as the site near a returned U.S. military base in Yongsan-gu District. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
U.S. President Donald Trump has declared what is calling economic D-Day against Iran, vowing unprecedented sanctions and warning any country that helps Tehran evade them. Kim So-young has the latest.
President Trump says he's launching the most sweeping economic isolation campaign ever waged against a single country, targeting Iran and any nation that helps it. In a post on Truth Social, Trump wrote that no one had given Iran a greater opportunity to make a deal than him, but tragically, they have failed to take it. He said he's launching what he called economic warfare and isolation on an unprecedented scale. The U.S. president warned that any country allowing its banks, businesses, airports, or government agencies to give Iran what he called a lifeline would itself face tremendous economic consequences. He specifically called out oil smuggling, currency swaps, cash transfers, ship registries, and front companies as tactics that, in his word, need to stop now. Asked whether sanctions on Iran would be impactful this week, Trump said,
"Well, we have things that we could sanction. We have very draconian sanctions, and we'll see what happens."
Iran dismissed the move as a distraction. The country's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi wrote on X on Thursday that so-called economic D-Day is a diversion from America's own crisis, citing unprecedented U.S. debt and surging interest costs. He added that doubling down on failed policies will only bring further defeat, and accused Washington of what he called economic terrorism. Reports point out that China is seen as a key target as it continues buying discounted Iranian oil despite existing sanctions. The UAE has already moved to comply, as President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan announced Tuesday after a call with President Trump that the UAE will halt all trade and financial dealings with Iran. Kim So-young, Arirang News.
The global hunt for critical minerals is ramping up as nations push to break free from dominant Chinese supply chains. Now, amid this push, a Korean tungsten mine is re-emerging as a key global partner. Our Kim Jun-hong takes us there.
Blasting takes place in the dark as geologists and workers move in and out. This is Sangdong Mine in southern Gangwon-do province, one of the world's largest tungsten mines. Some 4.7 kilometers of tunnels lie beneath the site, where there are an estimated 58 million tons of reserves. Tungsten is invisible to the naked eye, but under UV light in the dark, it becomes visible in a distinctive blue. Sangdong had closed its doors amid competition from cheaper Chinese tungsten. But more than 3 decades later, the mine has reopened with full-scale commercial production. Annual output stands at around 2,300 tons, with processing capacity set to double in phases.
Tungsten deposits here have an average grade of about 0.43%. That's about 3 times the global average, which allows for stable production over the long term.
Tungsten is key to industries from defense and semiconductors to aerospace. Demand has surged for high-performance chips, while the U.S.-Iran war has further strained global supplies. Chinese export controls are adding to the squeeze. The country produces around 80% of the world's tungsten, but supplies have fallen sharply since Beijing restricted exports of critical minerals last year, citing national security. Tungsten prices have soared since then. With critical minerals emerging as a new geopolitical weapon, Washington is racing to cut its reliance on China and diversify supplies. That is putting Sangdong in the spotlight as a key source of non-Chinese tungsten, with most of its output contracted for the U.S.
Building a value chain to develop and supply more tungsten is strategically important for Korea amid China's export controls. This would serve as an alternative supply source for our allies. Such cooperation could later act as a bargaining card for Korea to secure critical resources when needed.
For now, Sangdong handles the initial stages of production, including mining and concentrating. Operator Almonte Korea Tungsten plans additional facilities nearby as plans for downstream processing gain pace. Kim Jong-un, Arirang News, 영월.
The heatwave advisory has been lifted across the capital region as showers bring some relief. But heatwave and tropical night advisories will take effect across Chungcheong-do provinces and the southern regions at 11 a.m. tomorrow. Tomorrow, rain will move into the central part of the country from the early morning hours. The northern central part of the country, including Seoul, could see 5 to as much as 60 millimeters of rain. Meanwhile, in the south, the heat will continue tomorrow, along with another round of showers. Tomorrow, Seoul will start the day at 24 degrees, Chuncheon 23, and Busan 25 degrees. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will get up to 30 degrees, while the southern regions, including Daegu, Gwangju, and Jeju, will all soar to 32 degrees. This weekend marks Cheoseol, a traditional seasonal milestone that signals the end of summer heat. But don't expect much Cheoseol magic this year. Temperatures will still climb to around 33 degrees Celsius. Now here's a look at the weather around the world.
That is all we have for tonight. I'm Kim Dami. From all of us here at Arirang, thanks for watching and good night.
For thousands of years, one breath has endured. More than a martial art, it is the Korean way of life. Taekwondo, connecting the world. Smarter than ever, Taekwondo leaps toward a new future, connecting the world through a single movement. The spirit of Korea meets the boundless energy of K-pop. No longer just a sport, Taekwondo is at the heart of K-culture, bringing Korea's spirit to the world. A beautiful culture, connecting heart to heart. We now strive to safeguard Taekwondo's community training culture as a treasured heritage for all humanity. The pride of Korea, Taekwondo.
해금은 두 줄로 된 현악기인데 저도 처음에 시작하게 된 거는 그 두 줄에서 너무 다양한 소리가 나오는 게 너무 신기했고 일단 해금이 되게 사람의 목소리랑 좀 비슷하다고 많이들 하세요. 줄을 눌러서 이렇게 음을 계속 왔다 갔다 진동하는 그런 형태를 띠고 있다 보니까 애절하다라고 많이 말씀을 해주시는 것 같아요. 이 곡은 제가 좀 오래 좋아했던 친구에 대한 제 여러 감정을 담은 곡인데요. 슬펐던 마음 혹은 뭐 고마웠던 마음 이런 여러 가지 감정들을 한데 묶어서 마음이 담긴 곡이라고 할 수 있겠습니다. 현대적인 음악으로 이제 재구성하는 단계를 거칠 때 항상 중요하게 생각하는 거는 음악의 분위기를 해치지 않는 선에서는 뭔가 전통적인 주법들, 식임새 이런 전통의 냄새라고 할까요? 맛? 이런 걸 살릴 수 있는 요소들을 좀 집어넣으려고 하는 편이에요. 저는 요새 연주하면서도 스스로가 마음도 편하고 몸도 편안한 음악들을 좀 자주 들려드리고 싶다. 제가 음악으로 위로받았던 것처럼 제가 하는 음악들로 여러분들이 좀 위로받을 수 있는 순간이 있었으면 좋겠다. 그런 무대를 만들려고 노력해야겠다라는 생각을 했던 것 같습니다.
When did it all begin? The beginning of joy embedded in daily life, where steps of learning meet a bigger world, and history coexists. The legend continues. Innovative technologies come together to unfold a new future, building a better tomorrow. A joy accessible to all, always present in your daily life. JDC.
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gen. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Seoul has put China's role on the Korean Peninsula back in focus. Beijing has pledged to play a constructive role in maintaining peace while keeping its distance from direct mediation between Washington and Pyongyang. But amid these diplomatic moves, North Korea fired a dozen short-range missiles towards the East Sea earlier today. And this launch comes as President Trump is pushing to revive dialogue with Pyongyang, while North Korea has dismissed his decision to scale back joint military exercises, but left the door open to another possible Trump-Kim summit. So where does this leave the latest push for diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula? For answers to this, we invite Dr. Ko Myung-hyun, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Strategy. A very big welcome.
Good evening.
And also joining us online is Brian Myers, professor of the Dongseok University's Minseok College School of Liberal Arts. A very big welcome too.
Thank you very much.
So let's first start our discussion with Dr. Go. So about Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit, what stood out to you the most?
Well, I think we can look at the readouts from the respective sides. So there's a clear difference between the Chinese readout of the meeting from Korea's. the Korean side, the host, the Foreign Minister Jo Yeon, emphasized the briefing that he's done to Minister Wang about the President Lee's declaration of peaceful coexistence, which was included in his Liberation Day speech on August 15th. And also he urged the Chinese side to have a more of a constructive role for the peaceful stability of the Korean Peninsula, as well as the denuclearization of North Korea. But in contrast, the Chinese readout doesn't mention the denuclearization of North Korea. And also, in fact, highlights something very peculiar and very specific about South Korea. Apparently, Wang Yi urged the Korean side to have a foreign policy that's focused on the self-national interest and that's independent from external influences, which is essentially a veiled statement criticizing the United States as well as South Korea's alliance with the U.S. So essentially China urging South Korea to drift away from its relationship with the United States. So this took a big contrast, clearly shows that the two sides haven't been able to come to an agreement or convergence of opinions. And so in that sense, it's not really, I would say, positive. I mean, it's not that bad in the sense that there hasn't been an open disagreement, but then we shouldn't really attribute too much value to this meeting. And also, there's a very interesting DPRK aspect to this. Besides the meeting that the two sides had, the Wang Yi was asked about what was Chinese reaction to President Trump's very sudden and surprising offer of having a meeting with Kim Jong-un and before the end of this year. The Chinese side essentially took a step back and said that this is an issue it's a bilateral issue between Pyongyang and Washington, as if China didn't really have a role in it or didn't want to have a role in it. So it shows that China is essentially, it goes beyond taking a neutral stance on this issue. You can even believe that China is taking the North Korean side because the Chinese side, Wang Yi mentioned that for the U.S. DPRK dialogue to go forward, the United States should essentially cease to have a hostile attitude towards North Korea, which is a verbatim repetition of what North Korea says about the U.S. attitude towards that country. So in that sense, China is essentially implying that it's completely on the North Korean side on this issue.
Right, so there certainly seems to be a gap in terms of understanding, but just as our Dr. Go has pointed out, one message that drew particular attention was Wang Yi calling on South Korea to pursue an, quote, independent foreign policy. Professor Myers, what about on your interpretation of this? What do you think Beijing really is asking about from Seoul?
Well, in the past, China has issued quite stern or high-handed warnings to the South Koreans in regard to disagreements, and that was always counterproductive. The Koreans are nationalists, and they do not like being talked to in that tone of voice by anybody. This time, I think the Chinese foreign minister has spoken much more cleverly and effectively, because since President Trump was reelected, America's interests have diverged quite markedly from South Korea's. You not only have serious disagreements on economic policy, on, coupon, on how much money South Korea should invest in America, even about the proposed semiconductor mega project in Gwangju. You also have basic disagreement about the scope and function of the alliance. Now, as far as South Koreans are concerned, and that includes moderate conservatives, this should be a purely defensive alliance to protect this country, whereas President Trump seems to want South Korea contributing to the war effort in the Middle East. And Major General Brunson has been likening South Korea to an aircraft carrier or a dagger aimed at China, which is, of course, South Korea's main trading partner. So there's been growing talk on the left here about the need for more autonomy and independence from the United States. And President Lee himself has been saying things to that effect, stressing the urgent need for the transfer of operational control to South Korea's military. By the end of his term, even. So China's foreign minister, I think, was appealing to that sentiment in his remarks because he does not want South Korea joining any potential American action in regard to Taiwan.
Right, so independent policy, they're saying indeed. Now, what about the Korean Peninsula? Beijing has referred to South Korea and North Korea as two countries. How significant is that language, and what does it tell us about China's view of this current inter-Korean relations?
Well, you could say it's a little bit hypocritical of Beijing, because if South Korea were to refer to China and Taiwan as two countries, there would be quite an uproar. But here, too, I think Beijing is appealing to a tendency that is already well underway here in South Korea. There's increasing support here for recognizing North Korea as a state. And according to polls, most South Koreans already see it that way anyway. And the Unification Minister, Chung Dong-young, has even publicly referred to it as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Now, sure, there is resistance to that sort of thing even inside this government, but nevertheless, it's a growing tendency here, which the Chinese naturally want to encourage. Why? Because they like the status quo. They know from Germany's unification, which was followed by a big eastward expansion of NATO, that Korean unification could well result in American soldiers being stationed along the border to China. So they would much rather that North Korea continue as a nuclear-armed buffer state. But at the same time, they want tensions reduced to a minimum, because they do not want to see a war break out on the peninsula that America might try to expand into China. And Beijing feels, as I do really, that the best way to stabilize the status quo on the peninsula is for both governments to recognize each other as legitimate states. I don't think that's going to solve the tension entirely, but it's a big step forward.
So keeping the status quo, it will be important for Beijing's national interest. Then what about China's role on the Korean Peninsula, Dr. Go? Beijing has pledged to play a constructive role, but it's also cautious about mediating between Washington and Pyongyang as well. So what kind of role are they willing to play right now?
Well, clearly, like the the Korea's expectation of a potential Chinese role in ensuring stability in the Korean Peninsula is probably it's unlikely to be met, because as Professor Meyer said, in a way, the Chinese are essentially putting on the table their own policy priorities when it comes to the Korean Peninsula. So it's a far cry from what China has done in the early 2000s, when China was hosting the six-party talks for North Korea's denuclearization, in which China indeed was playing a very constructive role, was investing its political capital in ensuring that North Korea would denuclearize eventually. Right, at the moment, China's strategic objective in the Korean Peninsula is less about essentially North Korea's denuclearization or lowering the tension in the Korean Peninsula, essentially not using North Korea, but siding North Korea in the most important strategic issues, including denuclearization. So as mentioned before, China intentionally took out the term denuclearization from the readout. So clearly, they have an eye on the North Korean interest here, because North Korea doesn't want to engage outside world when the agenda dictates that they have to talk about denuclearization. So besides that, China also is using the two-state terminology that North Koreans are advancing at the moment. So in that sense, China is essentially echoing the North Korean positions to the South Koreans. So in that sense, China is not having a role as an honest broker here. It's more of a spokesperson for North Korea in an international setting. So this is something that South Korea should take into consideration when they deal with China, especially if the ultimate objective is to use the Beijing channel to reach the North Korean side. So I think we have to temper expectations when it comes to China.
So from Seoul's point of view, there could be some limits that we would expect from Beijing. But Washington, it's taking its own steps regarding Pyongyang. President Trump scaled back U.S. exercises, which is a move that's welcomed by President Lee, of course. Then what would that mean for allied readiness and deterrence?
Well, so clearly this was a surprise to many, especially on the military side, because we had an Ultra Freedom Shield exercise going on at the moment. So, this kind of a midway interruption is unprecedented. I think it surprised many concerned on both sides of the ocean, in the Washington as well as in Seoul, in a wrong way. But having said that, I think it's a profound impact when it comes to some of the policy objectives pursued by the Lee Jae-myung administration. So, for instance, President Lee wanted to wrap up the transfer of the operational control of South Korean forces during wartime before the end of it, actually by 2028. But for that, the South Korean military would have to meet certain conditions, and the condition would include demonstrating its capability to lead a joint forces command instead of the United States. So, and for that, they have to use this kind of exercises as a major test basis. But then nonetheless, this exercise interruption has essentially taken away an opportunity for South Korea to demonstrate such capability. So, in conclusion, which probably going to delay the Econ transfer process. It's unlikely for South Korea to be able to get back the Econ wartime outcome before 2028 at this rate. So I think this is probably something intended by President Trump to pressure the South Korean government. And clearly, the reason was mentioned by President Trump. He's upset about the fact that South Korea is now proactive in helping the United States in the Middle East, as well as the slow rate of implementation of the investment commitment promised by the South Korean side. So I think this all is affecting the South Korean side in a negative way. So I think President Lee is probably feeling that the only silver lining here is President Trump's revealed intention to sit down with Kim Jong-un before the end of the year, which would advance President Lee's North Korea policy agenda.
So it would have negative impacts, but when it comes to dialogue with North Korea, that will pay it off, right? But to many surprise, Pyongyang has sent a mixed message regarding this. Kim Yo-jong dismissed the UFS reduction while calling the Trump-Kim relationship excellent. And also just a few hours ago, the regime fired a series of ballistic missiles into the East Sea as well. Professor Myers, how should we read into this mixed messaging?
Well, clearly, Kim Yo-jong wants to encourage President Trump in his soft line thinking, and she knows that he does not take kindly to insults. You know, she used to insult President Moon Jae-in all the time, and he would just keep on smiling. But President Trump is not that type of person. On the other hand, you could say that President Trump spoiled the North Koreans during his first term by simply canceling Ulchi Freedom Guardian, as it was called then, at Kim Jong-un's request. Now, 8 years have passed since then, and North Korea is a much stronger and more prosperous country now, arguably with a lot more stature on the international stage as well. So as Pyongyang sees it, the very least that Washington should do now, if it's serious about wanting a new relationship, is to cancel UFS altogether. So it's not necessarily a mixed message, I think. It's more of an indication that North Korea knows it has a much stronger hand than it did 8 years ago, and it expects to be treated accordingly by the White House. Now, as for these short-range missile launches, they've traditionally been a kind of rhetorical flourish for the regime in Pyongyang. They're its way of saying, we are neither impressed nor frightened by what you guys just did. We continue to mean business. These launches do not really raise the temperature very much in the region because they represent no great technological advances. And they happen so often these days that, you know, people are not surprised or shocked by them, but they do serve the purpose of signaling resolve and firmness.
Right, so it kind of means that Pyongyang is wanting more from Washington. Then, Dr. Go, what kind of approach should Washington take on North Korea without giving away too much too soon?
Well, I think in a way, I think President Trump hasn't really implemented his own lessons about the deal making here. I agree with Professor Myers on this, that North Korea has a much stronger position when it comes to negotiating with Trump compared to 8 years ago. Clearly, clearly this offer of a dialogue was tendered out by the United States first, and also the United States made the first move, essentially a first concession to North Korea to bring Kim Jong-un to the negotiation table by canceling the Ultra Freedom Shield exercise midway. So these are huge gestures that North Korea has been asking for many years, but at the moment, at this time, North Korea clearly feels that it has a much stronger negotiating hands. So I think North Korea is going to ask more for an eventual summit to materialize before the end of this year. So I think President Trump understands this, but nonetheless, I think the fact that President Trump is not trying to play hard to get, so to speak, in these negotiations with North Korea shows that President Trump is essentially come to terms with the fact that the United States doesn't really enjoy a strong position vis-a-vis North Korea. So I think this is really going to be about limiting the downside to a potential summit between President Trump and Kim. There is just increasing concern both Seoul and Washington that President Trump might actually promise too much. And here, even though his promise might not be implemented eventually, what matters here is that some of the arguments, or some of the terms he's going to use could advance North Korean agenda and interests. For instance, if President Trump uses the term nuclear weapon state, that has the function of legitimizing North Korea's illicit nuclear program, for instance. And for President Trump, who doesn't get obsessed with these kind of terms, might think that this is a very low concession, but nonetheless, it's going to have a huge ramifications for North Korea policy everywhere for the international community down the road. So in that sense, I think these are the small concessions that President Trump might think this is just an entreaties for North Korea just to talk, but because he might think that there's no tangible, concrete downside to this. But nonetheless, these are exactly the kind of concessions and goals that North Korea might be pursuing through meetings with President Trump in person for later this year.
Then what about the role of South Korea? President Lee said that Seoul would act as a pacemaker for U.S.-North Korea dialogue. What kind of role would that actually look in practice?
So I think President Lee's use of the term pacemaker to President Trump's role as a peacemaker is essentially a tacit recognition of the fact that South Korea doesn't really have a channel of communication with Pyongyang, therefore no leverage vis-a-vis North Korea at the moment. It's a fact that South Korea's role in any kind of negotiation with Pyongyang is going to be minor. So I think President Lee is using the term pacemaker for South Korea's role in this negotiation in North Korea as to limit it, essentially the work that what South Korea can do. I think what South Korea can do in these kind of scenarios will be limited to supporting the United States, obviously, but supporting in the sense that essentially siding with President Trump's as initiative vis-a-vis North Korea fully and completely. So making sure that Seoul and Washington doesn't really show disagreement and some of the contentious issues, for instance, denuclearization issues. If President Trump were to use the term nuclear weapon state, I think President Lee might in fact not protest such a use of a term. So essentially, President Lee essentially limiting the South Korea role to be pick a good supporting staff without disagreeing with President Trump, at least publicly.
So all of this happening, definitely North Korea is in a different position from the past years. Then, Professor Myers, what would be a realistic goal for diplomacy at this time?
Well, the most realistic approach, I think, might be instead of another, big flashy summit, just to quietly pursue small trust-building measures and then build on them. I could imagine, for example, a working level agreement on risk reduction measures. So, North Korea agreeing to establish a military hotline to give the Americans a heads up before missile launches, even short-range missile launches, in return, say, for an American pledge to downscale all exercises or maybe to cancel one big annual exercise for good, that kind of thing. And if that holds, the two sides could move on to a North Korean agreement to, say, cap ICBM production and testing in return for the Americans formally recognizing North Korea as a nuclear power. But as Dr. Go says, The Americans have perhaps already conceded too much. I think it was 4 times last year that Donald Trump already referred to North Korea as a nuclear power, and he's really given a lot away without getting anything in return. But with everything going on right now, I don't think even modest progress would be realistic this year. I mean, Kim is committed to fighting with Russia, and he's not going to want to endanger that very lucrative relationship with Moscow to sign a deal with an American president who clearly does not take signed agreements very seriously, as the Iranians found out. Now, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think we're going to see substantial diplomatic progress until at least one of those 2 big wars is resolved. So either the war in Ukraine or the one in the Middle East.
Right, so definitely a lot is going on and a lot of uncertainty, of course. So expectations may have to be different this time around, and we'll have to see whether this latest diplomatic momentum could actually lead to some fruitful results. But as for now, we'll have to leave our discussion right here tonight. Dr. Go, thank you so much for your insights.
My pleasure.
And of course, Professor Myers, we really appreciate your time.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.